Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Amnon Aran. He is a professor of international politics of the Middle East and the head of the Department of International Politics at the City University of London. He was previously a fellow in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Aran has also contributed to policymaking through his work with the European Union's Middle East Peace Task Force, and he has commentated on Middle Eastern affairs for the BBC, Bloomberg, and CCTV. He's the author of Foreign Policy Analysis, New Approaches, published by Routledge in 2016, and his latest book, Israeli Foreign Policy Since the End of the Cold War, published by Cambridge University Press last year. He'll be talking about that book today. During Dr. Aran's presentation, I encourage you to send us your questions using the Q&A box that you can see on your screens, and I will select through these questions and pose them to Dr. Aran after his presentation. So without any further ado, let me welcome Dr. Aran and turn the floor over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dov, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all very much for attending this talk today. I think I'll try and talk for about 30 minutes or so on the book and what it tries to say and argue. And I thought I should probably start with a brief exercise of placing the book's subject matter in context, which is, of course, the end of the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War really ushered in a new period in Israeli foreign policy, situating Israel in an unprecedented, strong strategic position. The collapse of the Soviet Union, which had supported Israel's Arab foes, ended the bipolar world order, and of course established the United States, Israel's closest ally, as the world's sole superpower. In addition, of course, shortly thereafter, during the 1991 Gulf War, a US-led coalition expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait following the invasion, and also exposed very deep and profound divisions within the Arab world, weakening the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, which supported the then Iraqi president Saddam Hussein during the conflict. Now, these dramatic international shifts really coincided with changes, quite profound changes within Israel itself. The successful restructuring of the Israeli economy by the 1985 Economic Emergency Stability Plan, and of course the arrival of close to 1 million immigrants from the former USSR during the 1990s greatly increased Israel's state capacity to really seize the opportunities, but also tackle the challenges that were generated by these very profound regional, international, and domestic developments. Now, as the Cold War drew to a close, Israeli foreign policy makers were very divided about what foreign policy path Israel should pursue in the wake of these dramatic changes. And in the book, I look at Israel's foreign policy as it was charted by its leaders in relation to 4 key arenas: the Middle East, the United States, Europe, and also great powers in Asia, namely India and China. And of course, I won't be able to go into every detail in relation to these 4 spheres, but of course, I'll be happy to expand in the Q&A if people wish to do so in further detail. So set against this backdrop, what I would like to do is a couple of things. I'd like to really identify, first of all, the foreign policy postures that Israel adopted since the end of the Cold War. And I think that's an important exercise because seemingly sometimes when we look at Israeli foreign policy, it seems like a sequence of events which are very difficult to explain, almost having no rhyme and reason. So I think it's quite important to identify if there is any coherence in Israeli foreign policy, and if so, what that coherence might entail. And then if I have time, I'll try and explain why some foreign policy paths prevailed over others, but if we don't, we can leave that to the Q&A. So I'll really focus on 3 questions. The first is what are actually the determinants of Israeli foreign policy. And here I have to, as they say, come clean route at the outset and really say that my book does adopt an approach that domestic factors determine foreign policy. I hope to provide something a bit more sophisticated than the known quip by Henry Kissinger: Israel has no foreign policy, only domestic politics. But the general idea is that when we have international events like the end of the Cold War, like 9/11, like the Arab uprisings for that matter, different players interpret these events or these international trends in different ways, and therefore they will adopt different responses, which will then translate to a different foreign policy behavior. So that's the first thing I'd like to tackle. The second thing I'd like to tackle is really what were the foreign policy postures that Israel adopted since the end of the Cold War and why. And I'll lay here three positions, key positions, which really organize the analytical framework of the book. And they are entrenchment, engagement, and unilateralism. And I'll say something about each in a bit. And like I said, if I have time, I'll try and offer explanations by some prevailed over the others, but if not, we can save that to the Q&A. So let me start with the sort of key determinants of Israeli foreign policy. And of course, my study is situated really within a very broad, very rich intellectual tradition. There's a very interesting body of literature that looks at Israel through the lens of the security network. This has been very, very interesting work by people like Gavriel Scheffer and Oren Barak. There's, of course, another school of thought that Israeli foreign policy, or argues that Israeli foreign policy conforms to what, if you like, international relations scholars refer to as realism. Supposedly, that kind of foreign policy is perhaps devoid from ideology and really follows very strictly a clearly identified national interest. And scholars like Clive Jones, to mention just one, have really pursued this path. And a third approach is really about Israeli foreign policy almost as a muddling through exercise, very unstrategic, very ad hoc, almost falling victim to the vagaries of Israeli coalition governments. And people like Chuck Freilich, to name just one example, but there are several others, have really developed this approach. Now, when I sort of look at the book that I wrote, I actually rejected the thrust of all three approaches. And instead, what I tried to do is propose what I would say is a loose model, really, of understanding Israeli foreign policy really as something that is determined by three concentric circles. And there is, if you like, a sort of soft hierarchy between these circles, which I think really prevails throughout the period that I looked at. Now, the first and most important circle, at least I think, is really the prime minister and the circle of confidants and trusted aides around him or her, which in the case of Israel is very interesting because often this sort of cadre, this very tight-knit circle, even replaces ministerial colleagues as the forum for foreign policy deliberation and thinking. And I would argue that all of Israel's key foreign policy decisions since the end of the Cold War, and if we think about some of the main ones, the decision whether or not to respond to the Iraqi missile attack, the decision to sign secretly the Oslo process with the PLO, the decisions regarding the unilateral withdrawals from Lebanon and subsequently Gaza. The list is very long, but the thrust of this is that all of them were first of all discussed, fleshed out within this, I would say, circle of trust. Then, of course, they were coordinated with the United States, particularly the president and his close advisory. And only then they were really brought, and in many cases as a fait accompli, to the cabinet. And the prime minister says, this is what we're going to do. And then the battle in parliament, the Knesset, begins. But the first deliberation really started in this intimate circle. Now, it's interesting, of course, to ask why this intimate circle, so influential, came about, and more interesting, perhaps, why does it endure and survive for so long? And I just want to offer a few explanations. I think the first one is that Israeli governments are always coalition governments, and that has created really a structure whereby prime ministers have not trusted fellow ministers to be partners that they can confide in when making what historian Ian Kershaw has described as fateful decision. And I just want to bring one quote from the chief of staff of Israel's former prime minister, the late Ariel Sharon, his chief of staff, Dov Weissglass. In an interview that I conducted with him, he said the following, and just bear with me for a few seconds. And this is what he told me when I asked him about this. The prime minister, I quote, will never come to the cabinet with an idea that has not been first tested with his intimate circle. Members of the cabinet are not people you can brainstorm with. For better or worse, in our political system, they are enemies of the prime minister. Those who sit with him around the table want to substitute him. 9 out of 10 want to replace him. 9 out of 10 are legitimately waiting for the prime minister's downfall. Therefore, they are not an appropriate forum for brainstorming. And I think this is a really crucial point that really recurrently was raised and said to me in various interviews. Just to give another example, Eitan Haber, who was the chief of staff of Yitzhak Rabin, quipped to me and said, look, young man, Yitzhak Rabin didn't trust his own shoes, so let alone he had any trust in his own cabinet members. And that was quite instructive and had quite serious consequences, as I will explain a bit later on. So this is one sort of source that really helps to understand why this very important circle came about and endures. The second one, of course, will be very familiar to this audience, and that is that a vote in government against a decision that often was taken already will first of all be a vote against the prime minister, but crucially also against the US president. And this is something that Israeli politicians, certainly those who aspire, have been rather reluctant to do, with some exceptions, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu's speech in Congress being one of them, but by and large, that has been the case. Now, of course, the third element that helps understand why this intimate circle endures is that, of course, the prime minister is the only policymaker that has access to the whole picture and gets information from all the relevant sources. And one of the things that really surprised me in my research is really to understand how much power Israeli prime ministers have in what is a vibrant democracy with a very lively press and so on and so forth. But their ability to take decisions, maybe after consulting with 2 or 3 people, for example, Yitzhak Rabin's decision about whether to negotiate with Syria or not, something I'll return to, or even the decision to sign secretly the Oslo processes, really key decisions that prime ministers can either pursue or block. And the fact that they really have all the information and access to everything is a key element to, and a key factor that helps understand why. Now, the fourth thing that I'd maybe like to sort of raise here, I mean, there are other things, but just one last thing is that Israeli prime ministers have successfully been able to, if you like, use this intimate circle as a almost web that bypasses the official Israeli state machine. And there are really numerous examples of this, starting with Mr. Ephraim Halevi, when he was deputy chief of Mossad, literally nailing down the peace agreement with Jordan, and Shimon Peres, the then foreign minister, getting the text no earlier than the actual signing ceremony. Ariel Sharon notably used to send his son in the early stages when he was negotiating with Yasser Arafat. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu had the almost eternal Yitzhak Molcho, who went around the world. And the list again is very long. So it's very important, I think, to recognize this sort of web that operates in parallel and often replaces what we as citizens would expect to be done by the state machine. And there is a big problem here because, legally speaking, according to Israeli law, the Israeli government, not this web of people around the prime minister, is responsible to and is accountable for the foreign policy conduct. Now, let me move quickly to the second circle, which again is slightly below in the soft hierarchy that I just discussed. And this is, of course, the security network, especially the Israeli Defense Force, but not only, which has significant power. But it is also conditioned by a few things. First of all, it is legally subordinated to the decision makers. And of course, it is embedded in Israeli society and its economy. In other words, the IDF, even the General Security Services and Mossad, but certainly the IDF, is not isolated, if you like, corporate entity, like in a military state or even in a professional army. It is porous to the influences from the political sphere, and hence I think it is subject to more limitations perhaps that the literature on security has ascribed to the security network idea. Now, the third sort of concentric circle is a bit not in the background, but it really comprises or is built from looking at this relationship between national narratives or national identity generally and foreign policy. And I think when we try and look about what possible links might exist between national narratives and foreign policy in the case of Israel, in the book I identified 5 of those. The first, of course, is that Israel is, after all, a Jewish state. Now, not all groups in Israeli society subscribe to this, not least Palestinian Israelis, but by and large, the majority Jewish part of society, if you're a secular or ultra-religious, they all have some sort of notion of Israel as a Jewish state. The second one is Israel as a Zionist state, right? The Zionist project. Again, not everybody subscribes to this view. Again, Palestinian Israelis, some ultra-Orthodox Jews, but still, and of course, there are many variations and versions of Zionism, but the general idea that Israel is a Zionist state and an extension, a continuation of the Zionist project is integral to the Israeli national narrative. The third sort of narrative that I would highlight, which emerged relatively late, I would say from the early 1980s, but certainly more in the 1990s, is Israel as the famous book, When Israel as a Startup Nation, right? This hub of technology, this very, very agile and sophisticated center that really was crucial for Israel being able to forge relations with countries like India and China, cement relations with countries like the United States. And of course, most recently, we've seen this appeal also in the Abraham Accords, something that I will go back and discuss a bit later. So that's the third one. The fourth, and I think one still feels this very, very powerfully, certainly in Israeli foreign policy, is the, if you like, role of the Holocaust, which people like Idit Zartal, I think, have written very revealingly about. And in the context of foreign policy, and particularly in times of foreign policy challenges or crises, the Holocaust emerges very powerfully. And often Israeli leaders, just to give an example, have referred to their foes, if it's Yasser Arafat or the presidents of Iran, as new incarnations of the Nazis. And of course, in a country and a government that already holds quite a high threat perception, integrating the Holocaust discourse, as I think probably Mr. Netanyahu has done more than others, increases this threat perception even further. But of course, there are serious questions that need to be asked. Is Israel really 1938? Probably we can think about a few reasons why not. And then finally, is Israel as a democracy? And I think this is perhaps something that is very interesting and somewhat in flux. And I think we could say that within the 1967 borders, Israel has a free press, free and fair elections, a competitive party system, universal suffrage, respect for freedom of speech. I often remind people that out of all the states in the Middle East, Israel is the only state that actually has an Islamist party in the coalition, which is an interesting, of course, fact in itself. But at the same time, of course, I think we have to recognize that Israeli democracy has been seriously impaired by the prolonged and deepening occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, to the extent, of course, that 2 leading human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights organization, have accused the Israelis of actually being an apartheid state, something that we might want to go back to. Not everybody would agree with that, but it is quite telling that this label has been adopted by such organizations. So having laid out some of these domestic these concentric circles, I think a last word on the national narratives that I would say is that they really impose, if you like, the contours that really determine, if you like, what is possible and what is impossible, what is legitimate and what is illegitimate in Israeli foreign policy. So it's not as if the foreign policy makers think continuously, oh, what's happening with the Holocaust, what's happening with Israeli democracy, but they do act as kind of contours that civil society and parties act within. And of course, they give leaders a repository that they can use to legitimize certain foreign policy paths and suppress or delegitimize others. So having laid out this sort of domestic, the domestic, if you like, sources of Israeli foreign policy, let me now move to discuss what were the key foreign policy postures that Israel adopted since the end of the Cold War. And as I said in the beginning of my talk, I really divided them. I developed this sort of analytical framework that really highlighted three key postures. Engagement is one, entrenchment is the other, and unilateralism is the third. And let me begin to say something about what entrenchment entailed. And this foreign policy posture, I would say, is primarily associated with two prime ministers. One is the late Yitzhak Shamir, who was the leader of Likud at the end of the Cold War. And of course, Israel's longest serving prime minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu. And when we look at sort of entrenchment, it is really based on three very clear principles. The first one is that Israel should make peace with the Arab world only in exchange for peace, rather than the formula that suggested that Israel has to exchange territories that it captured or occupied in the 1967 Arab-Israeli war. So that's element number one. The second element of Israel's entrenchment foreign policy stance is that its foreign policy towards the Middle East, but also beyond, is primarily gives premium to developing Israel's, what Avi Shlaim called Israel's iron wall of military might, rather than relying on diplomacy or multilateralism or international institutions and so on and so forth. And then I would say the third element is that the Palestinians residing in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and at least until 2005, could be granted some limited autonomy, but they would ultimately remain under Israeli military occupation. Now, I think it's interesting to ask sort of, what are the sources of this foreign policy? Where does entrenchment stem from? What explains this particular foreign policy stance? I think the first idea that we need to look at is a long-held belief of the Israeli right and of these particular individuals, Shamir and Netanyahu, which is basically the right they claim that Israel has over the whole of the land of Israel, from the Mediterranean Sea to the river. And this is an historical right, not necessarily a religious right, but an historical right. The second one is that the Arab states really cannot be trusted to keep their side of the bargain in a deal that would be based on exchanging land for peace. In other words, Israel has to hold its assets even in the context of a peace agreement with the Arab side. And the third, which I think is highly significant, is that there is a belief within the entrenchers that time is on Israel's side. Israel will develop, will consolidate, will become more powerful, and in the end, the Arab states, and indeed the rest of the world, will come round to recognizing Israel in its post-1967 borders. And of course, the most, I think, significant vindication, the clearest really vindication of this approach was Mr. Netanyahu's ability to sign the Abraham Accords for Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, without exchanging or giving back an inch of territory. Let me now move quickly to the other side of the spectrum. And the other side of the spectrum is occupied by Israel's foreign policy of engagement. And this foreign policy, again, is, I would say, associated primarily with Prime Ministers Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, who were all the leaders of the Labour Party, once upon a time Israel's largest center-left party, and indeed the continual sort of party that vied for control and for government. And what is interesting about engagement, and also about these individuals in particular, is that all three prime ministers, Barak, Peres, and Rabin, were all more optimistic than Shamir and Netanyahu about the opportunities that were presented by the end of the Cold War, but also about Arab intentions. And at the same time, all three were also much more pessimistic about the prospects of a prolonged occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip until 2005, of course, And that's why engagement was very different from entrenchment. And it also really relied on three very clear pillars. First of all, you make peace with the Arab world in exchange for returning territories. And I emphasize not all the territories, but territories that Israel has occupied or had occupied after the 1967 war and subsequently. And we need to recall that at the end of the Cold War, Israel was holding a security zone in Lebanon, about 10 kilometers into the country, in addition to the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. So we're talking about an expanded sort of control or occupation of territories than we have now. But the notion was that you use land in exchange for peace. The second is that you put a premium on diplomacy rather than on military force. So military force is not thrown out of the window, but the premium is clearly on diplomacy when engaging with the Middle East and, of course, further afield. And then finally is that downscaling the Israeli occupation was seen by these individuals and the Israeli center-left at the time as a clear Israeli national interest. And this was really the background to some of the key decisions that were taken by Labour governments throughout the 90s, and also perhaps by the Olmert government a bit later, but primarily these three governments: the decision, of course, to embark on the Oslo process with the PLO, the decision to negotiate very seriously with Syria about withdrawing from the Golan, Israel withdrawing from the Golan in return for a full normalized peace with the Assad regime. Both of those, of course, failed, but at the same time, they were clear successes. And they included the peace agreement with Jordan, which was very much on the back of Israel's negotiation with the PLO. And another success, which was, I think, understated in the literature, which really fascinated me. And that is how what I called in the book, the dividends of engagement. In other words, the very fact that you just negotiate with the PLO or with the Arab side opened for Israel vast opportunities, economic, military, political, diplomatic, in India and in China, with one difference, that the relation with China is still very much conditioned by US limitations. So there are certain technologies, for example, that Israel is not allowed to sell to China. There's certain arms that Israel is not allowed to upgrade. But with India, by contrast, these limitations don't exist. And this relationship really thrived and developed throughout the 90s on the back of the peace process, or these dividends of engagement. And by the 2000s, developed a life of its own. Now let me move to sort of the third foreign policy approach that I mentioned, and this is unilateralism. And unilateralism, in a sense, was built on a realization. I think that the Israeli right would say probably a false realization, but nonetheless, a perceived realization at the end of the 1990s that the ability to sign a peace agreement with the PLO and other Arab sides is impossible, or at least Syria and the Palestinians in particular. But at the same time, it was really detrimental to Israel to keep the occupation. And this was really the background that emerged, that really brought about unilateralism. And the idea was here that Israel withdraws from land that it occupied, but not within the framework of an agreement with an Arab counterpart, once Israeli foreign policy makers deemed that to be unachievable. And instead, and this is, I think, quite innovative from the part of Israeli foreign policy makers, Israel negotiated its withdrawals, its unilateral territorial withdrawals, to recognize borders with the international community. And it's in this context that Israel carried out two major unilateral withdrawals. One, of course, was from Lebanon in 2000, and the second one was in August 2005 from the Gaza Strip. And what is interesting here is two things. First of all, since the withdrawals were carried out without a mutually binding agreement with an Arab counterpart, Israel would manage them by using military means, diplomatic means, economic means, but also Israel hoped that the legitimacy that was given to it by withdrawing to international borders would translate into international support to its position. And this is precisely why the Israelis were really pedantic about getting the okay from the UN via resolution 425 that the border with Jordan is the international border, and why also they evacuated even one settlement, Dugit, that was merely 50 meters behind the international recognized border to exactly establish that certainty that it had withdrawn to international recognized borders. So that's really what unilateralism was about. And I think it is interesting that it embodied the understanding that was shared by really 5 of 7 Israeli prime ministers since the end of the Cold War, who came from very different persuasions, right? Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, and Ehud Olmert, coming from very different places in Israeli politics. But all of them came to the same conclusion that the Israeli occupation was detrimental and that the control of land, the advantages were outweighed by, if you like, 3 key challenges that Israel faced if it continued to hold these lands. And let me maybe say something about these 3 challenges. The first challenge, and I think that was shared by all 3 prime ministers, was that the prolonged occupation posed a threat to Israel remaining a democratic state, as it held millions of citizens without rights that were enshrined, of course, in other democratic regimes. And the notion that Israel could not afford, in terms of its security, to withdraw from these territories was not shared by these 5 prime ministers, at least. But of course, Netanyahu and Shamir were firmly against this. The second, of course, concern was that in the event that Palestinians would outnumber the number of Jews in the area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, Israel would effectively cease being a Jewish state. And that was a grave danger that each of these prime ministers identified. And of course, both of these developments, Israel ceasing being a democratic state and Israel ceasing being a Jewish state, were also seen as a real strategic threat to Israel, because the assumption, again, of Olmert, Barak, Sharon, Rabin, Peres, and so on, was that as these foundations of Israel, if you like, erode, Israel's ability to be able to present itself as having shared values with Western allies, most crucially the United States, but also Western Europe, of course, would become increasingly difficult, and hence that would pose a direct threat to Israeli security and prosperity. And with all the talk about a pivot to Asia and all this, these 5 prime ministers were certainly firmly believing that there was no alternative to the security provisions, diplomatic support, and political support that the United States provides Israel. And when it came to trade, the unescapable fact is that the EU is still Israel's greatest trading partner, afterwards the United States, and then afterwards different other parts of the world. Now, I was tempted to try and give sort of my last spiel and say which of the 3 foreign policy postures prevailed and why, but I think I have taken my half hour and I'd like to leave as much time as possible for discussion. So I think I'll leave it at that. I will just maybe throw one teaser and say that ostensibly entrenchment has won, given Netanyahu's success in the Abraham Accords. But perhaps if we look a bit deeper, then as the saying goes, it's not necessarily so. But I'll leave it at that. And I think I'll end here so we can discuss and have enough time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aran, for that very clear and illuminating presentation. I'm going to come back to your claim about the whether entrenchment has won. So we'll return to that tantalizing claim. Before we continue, I just want to encourage everybody to send in your questions using the Q&A, and we'll have plenty of time to get to them. I want to go back. You laid out really clearly your analytical framework for understanding Israeli foreign policy and the 3 concentric circles. Before I pose my first question, I want to just point out to the audience how significant this kind of approach is, because all too often Israeli foreign policy, to the extent that it is a focus of academic research, and there is in fact not that much academic research on this topic, it's really tended to be kind of the traditional narrative style histories, rather than really providing any clear analytical framework. And so I think Dr. Aran's book is really important in offering a clear analytical framework and saying that we can study this with the same kinds of theories and tools of analysis that we study other states' foreign policies. So when it comes to Israeli foreign policy, I think you're absolutely right in identifying these 3 concentric circles and starting out with the prime minister and their kind of informal kitchen cabinet. And this is, of course, something that has been true of Israeli prime ministers going back to Ben-Gurion, that really there was this tendency to have this kind of informal network of advisors, of confidants, to the exclusion of the more formal bureaucratic channels, and particularly to the exclusion of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So I wonder why this is the case. I mean, there's been constant attempts, or at least periodic attempts, to actually impose some more order and bureaucratize Israeli foreign policy making. And to, for example, the creation of the National Security Council was an attempt to establish a more transparent and more bureaucratic. So why do you think there's this continued tendency? Is it specific to Israeli culture, a kind of preference for these informal networks over more formal bureaucratic decision-making? What explains, in your view, the fact that, 7 decades into Israeli statehood, there is still this, major decisions are still done kind of around the kitchen table, as Golda Meir used to famously do?
Yeah. No, I think it's an excellent question, Dov, and thank you also for your kind words about the book. I think that there are a number of things at play here. I think one is exactly what you said, the precedent that was set by Ben-Gurion, and the fact that he served for such a long time as prime minister has set in train some of the dynamics, especially, and legitimized this practice that it's okay to discuss things by a group of people who understands, quote unquote, much more than everybody else and doesn't need the advice of the technocrats and so on and so forth. But you're right, it doesn't explain the whole story. I think the other thing, certainly in relation to the period that I looked at more closely, I think one thing that I do mention in the book is the fact that actually the Israeli political system has fragmented quite dramatically in the 1990s. So if we look at Israel's political system, let's say, from 67 to the early 90s, until, let's say, Yitzhak Rabin was elected. So we're talking really about two major parties, Likud and Labour, and then they have a coalition government with a few satellites. What's interesting is that today we talk about a landslide victory when the biggest party comes up with 3 seats, 25% of the Knesset. It's not exactly a landslide victory, it's just somebody was able to get to it. And that exacerbates even further the problem that I described initially in my discussion. They're really, for an Israeli prime minister to discuss these very, very touchy and very politicized matters is very, very perilous in terms of their ability to maintain and remain in government. And again, when we look at Israel's foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, of course, some members of the audience here will remember the famous slogan, Paris will divide Jerusalem, right? If Ariel Sharon would have even thought about raising to Mr. Netanyahu the idea of withdrawing from the Gaza Strip before he had sort of got all his ducks in orders, this idea would have never come to life, and let alone would have been pursued. So I think this political fragmentation has really politicized the decision-making process and has almost compelled Israeli prime ministers to really first get all their ducks in orders, and they honestly cannot trust, which says something also about, and that's your last point, about the political culture, about this idea of this notion that some things are not done, for better or worse, has really been stretched since the end of the Cold War. I think we really saw this culminating in the last days of Mr. Netanyahu, where this notion of some things are not done was almost destroyed altogether. But I think nevertheless, this thing that norms kind of hold things together became quite a loose idea. And those, I think, would be the main kind of explanations that I would highlight. There are others, but I think those would be the main 3 that I would mention.
Let me ask you about the second concentric circle that you identified, the security network, what's often referred to as the kind of the security establishment. Yeah. And clearly, they do have an important influence in shaping Israeli foreign policy. During Netanyahu's years in office, there were frequent reports of disagreements between Netanyahu and the security establishment. There were often leaks coming out from some members of the IDF, former heads of Mossad were often very critical of Netanyahu. When there is a conflict or a disagreement, as there seemed to be during Netanyahu's years between the security establishment and the prime minister, I mean, your framework would suggest that in the event of that, the power lies with the prime minister. It's because of the centralization of decision-making. But you could see, the fact that Netanyahu didn't order the bombing of Iranian nuclear sites because he was basically, I believe, blocked from doing that by this security network. Does it not show that really they are able to, because of the high regard that the IDF is held in by Israeli society, because of their own aura of legitimacy, if you like, that they're actually able to exert a greater influence, sometimes maybe a negative one, as blocking things, preventing annexation of the West Bank could be another example, which was kind of, slowed down and eventually prevented. Do they maybe have a little bit more influence than one might imagine, because they just tend to operate, and we're talking about kind of anonymous network for the most part?
So this was my entry point when I started my research, but when I ended it, I almost thought that it was a myth, and I'll tell you why. First of all, about Netanyahu, I think I can't comment about Netanyahu's intention to bomb Iran or not, because I really don't know if he intended to do it. I don't know how much of it was rhetoric and how much was not. Naftali Bennett mentioned recently there was almost very big gap between what Netanyahu said rhetorically and what he actually prepared to do. So I don't know about that. But what I can say is that if I look at, again, key decisions that the security establishment was against, the prime ministers always got their way. And let me give a few examples. The unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. Mr. Moshe Ya'alon, who was then the Israeli chief of staff, writes in his biography, he wrote, I was dead against it. The military was dead against it. Sharon imposed it upon us. And he's right. That's what happened. Look at the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon. Again, we know today the IDF was dead against it. They were trying to fight tooth and nail, but even Barak, who was relatively a weaker prime minister, imposed it. Look at the Oslo process. Mr. Barak described it as a yellow cheese full of, it's a Swiss cheese full of holes. And what did Rabin do? He gave his generals a hug and sent them to negotiate with the Palestinians. And even in the event of, the decision not to respond militarily to Iraq's missile attacks in the 1991 war, Yitzhak Shamir really held his nerve amid calls in the army and within his own cabinet that Israel should retaliate. And there's several other examples of this. So actually, when I looked at, these just 5 examples, when really the IDF is not silent, they're very, very vocal. I think usually the prime ministers got their way. There is one example that I found where the IDF completely got its way, and that was, but I think that's a bit an exception that doesn't necessarily prove the rule, when the Second Intifada or the Al-Aqsa Intifada erupted. Because when the demonstrations started, I'm sure the audience here remember, famous visit of Ariel Sharon, then leader of the opposition, in the Al-Aqsa compound. There were demonstrations that would get, the response of the Israeli army was very resolute. I'll be here a bit understated if I can. And the Barak government, who was already a minority government though, tried to rein the IDF in, but to no avail. And again, if you read the biography of, sort of autobiography of people like Mr. Ya'alon, who was then the deputy chief of staff, it was very clear that the IDF had a plan and that they were preparing for what they were describing as a war, and they got the government off guard. But what I'll say, and with this I'll end about this point, the Barak government at the time was an exception in the sense that it was a minority government. It had 30 MKs, it was almost out of office. But when you have a functioning government, I haven't found yet, and I'm very happy to be challenged on this, the example where the Israeli prime minister wants to go in one direction and the army and the security apparatus is able to block it.
Thank you for that. Now I want to turn to these patterns of foreign policy in terms of engagement and entrenchment and unilateralism, which you explained so clearly. And I think in many ways, we can think of engagement versus entrenchment, even going back much further to, Moshe Sharet and Ben Gurion. So there's a kind of consistent debate and tension between these two approaches. Even in a way, I would argue we could see them in Zionist diplomacy from an even earlier period. I want to though ask, and we had a question about unilateralism. Unilateralism of the type practiced, most famously by Sharon in terms of the disengagement from Gaza. Is that really is that so much of a kind of a third way, or there was an attempt to be a third way between these two long-standing approaches? If so, is that essentially dead today? I mean, is this brief experiment in unilateralism, essentially being delegitimized in the minds of Israelis because they believe, whether correctly or not, that the unilateral withdrawals from Lebanon and the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza just brought Israel more insecurity, rocket fire, and the creation of essentially, hostile regimes on Israel's borders. So if unilateralism is dead today and not likely to be revived, are we still really back with these two core approaches, engagement versus unilateralism? Versus entrenchment.
Yeah, so I think the way I would refer to unilateralism is probably that it's not dead, but it's asleep. And I think that, this goes back to why these different postures, prevailed at different times. Unilateralism really got quite a dent by two sort of events in the 2000s. One, of course, was that Israel withdrew from Lebanon in 2000, and then the conflict with Hezbollah, backed by Iran, continued, and of course culminated in the Israeli Hezbollah war of 2006, where Israel performed very unconvincingly, to put it mildly. And of course by the continuing conflagrations with Hamas following the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. So these sort of continuous conflicts from territories that Israel withdrew from really instilled in the Israeli psyche, and of course was used by the Israeli right to say, look, this is what happens when you leave territory or when you exchange land for peace. But even if you leave territories unilaterally, what you're going to get, you're not going to get peace and security, as everybody maintained. You're going to get a much more difficult and challenging security environment. But I think the reason why I'm saying that it is asleep is that the potential challenges that people like Yitzhak Rabin and Barak and Peres associated with the occupation have not really come yet to the fore. And do you know what? Maybe they won't. But I think if Israel faces a real acute situation where its ethical place in the world begins to resemble, regimes like in South Africa or other regimes, that's when unilateralism has a potential to come up again, because it will be very difficult perhaps to find a partner that even wants or is able, for that matter. And we need to remember, for example, the Palestinians are deeply fragmented. Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the PA seen almost as a subcontractor of the Israeli occupation. So it's not even clear that you have a side to negotiate on the Arab side. Syria, of course, after or in the context of the civil war, again, it's not the same kind of robust regime that Israel thought it had in the 1990s. And that's why I think if these two considerations come to a head, in other words, Israel's legitimacy and therefore ability to trade and receive its traditional backing from Western countries come to a head with the existing occupation, unilateralism might raise its head again. Alternatively, I think engagement actually is the one that's almost dead, because engagement is probably the posture that is least supported today in Israel. And I'll end with this on this point, that even the traditional parties that we once thought on the Israeli left as being staunch supporters of engagement, a party like Meretz, right? Even that party has abandoned. We don't hear about land for peace anymore. It's gone. It's been evaporated from the Israeli discourse. And you can't just resurrect it out of nothing. So I think actually between the three, engagement has potentially the least support, but it doesn't mean that Israel's problems have been solved by entrenchment either, because of this potential to find itself in, if you like, this very deep and problematic situation.
Well, I agree with your analysis, but I would just to push back a little. Wouldn't you say that the signing of the Abraham Accords, these normalization agreements with Arab states, has in some ways elevated the value of diplomacy? Once again, has shown actually to Israelis that, you know, the military force is all very well, although in fact military force has been shown in Israel's recent mini wars with Hamas to have actually of limited utility. All of the military power in the world that Israel has is not able to get its way vis-a-vis militarily weaker powers. But what the Abraham Accords have shown is actually that diplomacy can be effective in advancing Israel's interest, that the whole world isn't necessarily against Israel, that even the whole Arab world isn't against Israel, and that the Middle East is opening up. So perhaps, hopefully, you might say that the signing of these by an entrencher, by somebody like Netanyahu, ironically, actually may have elevated the value of diplomacy and shown that former enemies or perceived enemies can actually become allies, and that you know, that the region isn't set in stone, as it was seen for many, many years as just this kind of undifferentiated mass of hostile Arabs. In fact, now Israelis are realizing that there are opportunities for Israel, and those opportunities are available through diplomacy, through engagement.
Yeah, I think that could be certainly one reading of the Abraham Accords, and I think it would be a very valid reading. The only sort of caveat I would put, or I'd maybe put two caveats. One is that, of course, these countries that you've mentioned are not in the immediate circle neighboring Israel, right? So I think, you know, and I think there is still a distinction that Israelis make, the leaders are certainly making between those countries and Israel's neighbors themselves. And secondly, and relatedly, of course, is that if anything, you know, this peace accords did, if you like, provide a triumph to diplomacy, but to the diplomatic approach that he could actually make peace with the Arab world without giving up an inch of territory. So I think that would be sort of the main thing. But you're right. I mean, I think certainly, you know, the idea that the circle of countries that are willing to engage with Israel, conduct peaceful relations with Israel, Egypt, Jordan, now countries in the Gulf. I think Sudan and Morocco are slightly a different kettle of fish in this context. It does give, if you like, a bit more energy and potential to the diplomatic discourse. Whether or not it is adopted in relation to Israel's immediate neighbors, certainly the Palestinians, I think we're a slight distance away from that at the moment. That would be my reading.
I would agree with that, but I want to pick up on that point. And there's a couple of questions that have come in, and I've wondered this myself as somebody who studies Israeli foreign policy. When we think about Israeli foreign policy, you know, we've often considered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, relations with the Palestinians, one of the key aspects of Israeli foreign policy. But should we, and a question comes from Miles Zitmore, should we think of Israel's relations with the Palestinian Authority as really not foreign policy at all, as domestic policy? Or, I mean, is it really not so much of a foreign policy issue? It's really about domestic, and in which there's a whole range of actors, I mean, that shape that relationship. I mean, and this more broadly has essentially Israel's relationship or policies toward the West Bank and Gaza. Should we actually think of these as domestic policy and not as foreign policy?
Fantastic question. And I think the answer is as follows. First of all, I think we should, so towards Hamas, I would say 100% foreign policy, right? Hamas is a transnational actor. It's a movement. It's got relations externally. Let's put it this way. The only thing that's missing from Hamas and the Gaza Strip to be a state is if we just put a sign in the UN and say Gaza, and that would be a state. If you look at sort of sociologist Max Weber, they've got everything that really he would require for a state: monopoly over violence, borders, which are not recognized yet internationally. They can tax their population. So if you like, in the Arab press, sometimes people refer to it as the poor emirate. But, you know, except this international legitimacy, Hamas is really controlling a very small, poor, impoverished state, which some would argue is even under siege. But I would say that, you know, this is a quintessential foreign policy issue. The PA is interesting. And in a way, the PA, you know, sort of didn't emerge out of, but I think we need to think about the PA in conjunction with the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The main reason that I would still classify this as a foreign policy issue is because the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Authority has a wide web of international, if you like, ties, which usually a domestic player would not have, right? It even has embassies here in London. We have the PLO embassy. So there is this sort of international presence that the PA and the PLO still have. But I would certainly agree with the sentiment that was raised in this question, that if increasingly Israel is really absorbing, almost by stealth, almost sort of sleepwalking, into absorbing the Palestinians of the West Bank and their institutions into Israel's domestic fabric. And indeed, that was really one of the big challenges that Yitzhak, again, the engagers tried to tackle. And in doing so, of course, entrenchment with all, and this is what I was going to say before, entrenchment with all the flair around it and the seeming short-term gains that it brings with it, it doesn't solve some of the key issues. It doesn't help cure, if you like, Israeli democracy. It doesn't help Israel's Jewish character. And I would say certainly sitting in Western Europe, and I'm sure the audience has thought about what's happening in California and in other parts of the United States, the notion of Israel as being maybe an unethical state, some would go as far as maybe saying an apartheid state, and so on and so forth, is something that is, I would say, expanding and not really reducing. So I think that's where we are really at this point.
So we only unfortunately have time. We're running out of time. I'm going to try and pose one final question. It's going to be a big one. But please, answer it as you like. This is in terms of the kind of priorities of Israeli foreign policy. And I think historically, and including since the end of the Cold War, the priorities have always been relations with Western countries, especially with the United States, as you said, so kind of pro-Western orientation, and the priority of the Arab-Israeli conflict and then the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and peace, let's say, as a shorthand, the pursuit of peace. Is it true today, in your view, and looking forward, looking into the future now, that these historic priorities are declining in their importance, that increasingly Israeli foreign policy is less focused or solely focused on relations with Western countries, even with the United States, and is now adopting a much broader view of, strengthening its relations with Brazil and Russia and China and India and a whole host of it, Indonesia, potentially, a whole host of other countries. So the kind of Western orientation is diminishing, and Israel is increasingly paying more attention to other parts of the world. And secondly, that peace, which was so long, the holy grail for Israeli diplomacy, is also no longer the priority. And so, in many ways, we're entering a new era. Netanyahu, it may be an example of this, where he was interested in engagement, but just not on the traditional. With the traditional actors on the traditional issues. So we're seeing now a kind of 21st century and post-Cold War foreign policy emerge, in which Israel is broadening out its relations with many countries, including rising powers like India and China, and no longer really emphasizing the conflict or even or the pursuit of peace.
So yeah, I think I'll try and answer that big question maybe with pointing to three trends, which I think I've sort of seen kind of across this period writing the book. I think the first trend, and we didn't have time to talk about it today, is of course the rise of Iran in sort of the footprint of Iran on Israeli foreign policy has really increased. I mean, in the early 1990s, Iran was, yes, it was on the agenda, but it certainly wasn't center stage, to the point that up until 2003, even 4 perhaps, there was no decision by the Israeli government who would actually deal with Iran. The first prime ministers that decided that Mossad is responsible to dealing with the Iranian threat was no other than Ariel Sharon. So that we're talking here about the early 2000s. Rabin paid a bit of attention, but it wasn't at the center stage. Peres didn't, even Barak didn't. And the approach of Israel until Mr. Netanyahu returned to power was that really the country that needs to lead the effort against Iran is the United States. And Israel can sort of be in the background and quite an involved partner in this, but not on the lead. And I think certainly two things changed that. One was, of course, that Netanyahu put this on the agenda. But the second, of course, is that most of Israel's historic foes, Iraq, Syria, Libya, are currently much less of a threat than they were, again, at the end of the Cold War. So there's been here an interest, and of course, thirdly, and related to that, that those Arab states that, if you like, remained intact, and this again goes back to Netanyahu's last 10 years, he was talking already in 2011 about this Israeli Arab axis. Nobody was listening. Everybody thought, oh, it's another publicity stint by Netanyahu. But yes, the Abraham Accords cemented this. So I think that, I would say, is one trend that was quite significant. The rise of Iran and the potential sort of opportunities that opened with peace further afield. I think the second trend, and you're absolutely right, which is connected, is yes, peace with the Palestinians was very serious on Israeli foreign policy, certainly in the 90s, and then back again under Ehud Olmert's prime ministership. But I think certainly in the last 15 years, we have seen that aspect diminishing quite dramatically. And I think it's related also to almost a realization that maybe there isn't this big solution. I think we ended the Cold War in this Fukuyama moment, right? Democracy, capitalism, the Soviet Union fell. There was a solution to the Cold War. And I think now we're sort of in an era where perhaps foreign policy leaders are less confident that this notion of a solution is even something that is viable. Finally, I think, and this will be relevant to everybody who studies Israel, certainly the audience, I think there is still a complete consensus in Israeli foreign policy and security establishment that there is no replacement for the United States as the main international backer. But, and this is a big but, there's also a perception of the United States being less engaged in the region. And we've seen this not only with Israel, but it's not a coincidence that the key players in the region, I'm thinking here about Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, of course, have become much more active against the backdrop of a seeming, at least, less proactive, involved foreign policy from the United States. So in a very similar way as hegemonic theory would tell us, when the hegemon leaves, regional players become more proactive. But I think still, the US is definitely seen as indispensable, with that small caveat that there's more room and more necessity to act regionally. Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, and we could continue this conversation. We've been really fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Aran, for sharing your knowledge, your insights. I want to thank our audience for joining us. There's much more in the book, so I would encourage you to get your copy. It's anybody who's interested in Israeli foreign policy, understanding the forces and the factors that shape it, I think would learn a great amount from the book. So thank you, Dr. Aran, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I want to encourage you all to join us again for our next webinar, which will be taking place on Wednesday, February the 2nd, when Dr. Gail Talshir, who is currently a visiting professor with us at the Nazarian Center, will give a presentation on how the Israeli right changed the rules of the democratic game. So hope I will see you all then, and wish you all the best. Thanks again. Thank you very much, Dov. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining, everybody. Thanks a lot.